Oh, don't mind Eleanor. Melissa Carter laughed loudly at the engagement party, lifting her champagne glass so the nearby tables could hear. She's Daniel's unemployed little sister. The room around them filled with polite laughter, the kind that spread quickly in elegant spaces where people assumed everyone else knew the joke. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Brooks, a quiet 67-year-old woman with silver hair pulled neatly into a low bun, wearing a simple navy dress that looked understated beside the glittering cocktail gowns surrounding her. The engagement party for her brother Daniel was being held in the ballroom of the Grand Harbor Hotel in downtown Chicago, a room filled with warm golden lights, polished marble floors, and tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Nearly 200 guests had gathered to celebrate Daniel Brooks and his fiancée Melissa Carter, and most of them came from the same professional world. They worked in marketing, corporate management, finance, and consulting, and the conversations drifting across the room were full of talk about quarterly targets, promotions, and the reputation of the company many of them proudly represented, Stonebridge Corporate Group. Eleanor stood near the edge of the room holding a glass of sparkling water, watching as laughter continued around Melissa's joke. Daniel stood beside his fiancée, smiling in that slightly awkward way he always had when Melissa said something bold in public, the way people sometimes smile when they are not sure whether to defend someone or pretend everything is harmless. Melissa tilted her head toward Eleanor with a bright, practiced smile. "I hope you don't mind the teasing," she added sweetly. "Daniel says you've always been the artistic one in the family." A few guests nodded politely as if that explained everything. One man in a tailored gray suit asked casually, "So, what do you do, Eleanor?" Melissa answered before Eleanor could open her mouth. "Oh, she's still figuring that out." The group chuckled again. Eleanor simply gave a small, calm smile, the kind that did not invite further explanation. Around them the engagement celebration continued, servers moving gracefully between tables carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres, soft jazz music drifting from the corner of the ballroom, and clusters of guests talking animatedly about the future. Several of them spoke with pride about their positions at Stonebridge Corporate Group, praising the company's rapid expansion and the leadership that had turned it into one of the fastest-growing consulting firms in the Midwest. Melissa herself mentioned more than once how exciting it was to be part of such a successful organization. "Stonebridge is practically family," she said at one point, raising her glass toward a group of colleagues. "Daniel and I both work there, and half the people in this room do too." Eleanor listened quietly from her seat as the conversation flowed around her, her expression relaxed, almost thoughtful, as if she were observing a play unfolding on stage. To everyone in that room she appeared exactly as Melissa had described, Daniel's quiet, slightly mysterious older sister who had never seemed particularly interested in corporate life. None of them had any reason to suspect that the calm woman sitting silently at table 7 held a secret that would soon change the tone of the entire evening, because the truth was something none of them had even considered. Eleanor Brooks was not unemployed. She was the majority owner of Stonebridge Corporate Group. The music continued to drift through the ballroom as conversations grew louder and warmer, the kind of atmosphere that always formed once the second round of champagne had been poured. Eleanor Brooks remained seated at table 7, her hands resting calmly around the cool glass of sparkling water, while the room carried on around her as though nothing unusual had happened. Across the table, 2 young marketing managers from Stonebridge Corporate Group were discussing a new client acquisition in Dallas, speaking with the confident tone of people who believed they were rising quickly in a successful company. One of them mentioned how the firm had recently expanded its operations across several Midwestern cities, including Chicago, Minneapolis, and St. Louis, and how the leadership team was rumored to be planning an even larger national push within the next year. Eleanor listened quietly as the conversation unfolded, her eyes occasionally moving toward the large engagement banner hanging above the stage where Daniel and Melissa stood greeting guests. Daniel Brooks looked comfortable in the attention, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, and introducing Melissa proudly to colleagues who had traveled from different branch offices. Melissa Carter, dressed in a sparkling ivory cocktail dress, seemed especially energized by the admiration surrounding her. She moved easily between groups of guests, laughing loudly, touching arms warmly, and repeating the same proud statement more than once that evening. She told anyone who would listen that both she and Daniel were proud members of the Stonebridge corporate family, a phrase she used as though it were the highest compliment a person could receive. At one point, Melissa returned to table 7 accompanied by a group of coworkers who appeared curious about Daniel's older sister. One woman asked politely if Eleanor had traveled far to attend the celebration. Melissa answered again before Eleanor could respond. She explained that Eleanor lived on the West Coast and preferred a quieter lifestyle away from the busy corporate world. The comment drew another round of friendly laughter, not cruel enough to cause discomfort, but pointed enough to make Eleanor the quiet center of the joke once more. Eleanor simply nodded politely and allowed the moment to pass without argument. She had spent many years in rooms like this, observing the subtle ways people measured status and importance through job titles, office locations, and the reputation of the companies they worked for. Across the ballroom, a tall man wearing a navy suit began speaking loudly about the upcoming restructuring rumors at Stonebridge. Several nearby guests leaned in with interest. Someone mentioned that the board of directors had been unusually quiet over the past few months, and that investors were expecting a major announcement before the end of the fiscal quarter. Melissa reacted with excitement, telling the group that she hoped the leadership team would reward the most loyal employees when the next wave of promotions arrived. Daniel nodded in agreement beside her, clearly proud to be part of the organization's future plans. Eleanor watched this exchange with the same calm expression she had maintained all evening. The guests around the table spoke about Stonebridge as if the company were an enormous machine operating far above their influence, something powerful and distant that shaped their careers but remained completely beyond their reach. None of them noticed the small thoughtful smile that appeared briefly on Eleanor Brooks's face as she listened to their speculation about the decisions that would soon come from the boardroom. Across the ballroom, the conversation about Stonebridge Corporate Group continued to grow louder as more guests joined the circle near Daniel and Melissa, each person eager to share a rumor, a prediction, or a personal story about the company that had quietly become the center of their professional lives. Eleanor Brooks remained seated at table 7 while the servers moved between tables carrying trays of small crab cakes and miniature sliders, the warm scent of food mixing with the soft jazz drifting from the corner stage. A tall man named Richard, who introduced himself as a regional sales director, spoke with the confident tone of someone who believed he understood the company well. He explained that Stonebridge had grown faster in the last 5 years than almost any consulting firm in the Midwest, and that the executive leadership team had built a reputation for strategic acquisitions that kept competitors constantly guessing. Several people nodded enthusiastically while Melissa leaned closer to the group, clearly enjoying the moment. She explained that she had joined the company 3 years earlier and that she loved the fast pace and the ambitious culture that surrounded the organization. Daniel added proudly that he had recently moved into a management role and that he hoped to continue climbing the leadership ladder as the company expanded. Their friends responded with encouragement, telling them that Stonebridge rewarded employees who showed initiative and loyalty. One guest mentioned that the board of directors had recently been meeting more frequently than usual and that many employees were expecting a significant announcement before the end of the year. The speculation quickly turned into friendly competition as several people began guessing which departments might be reorganized and which executives might receive promotions. Melissa laughed brightly and raised her glass again, saying that she hoped she and Daniel would benefit from any leadership changes that might happen soon. Eleanor listened quietly from her chair, the faint smile returning briefly to her face as the group continued discussing decisions that they assumed were being made somewhere far away in a quiet boardroom. A young financial analyst sitting nearby noticed Eleanor's attentive expression and asked politely whether she followed business news as closely as the rest of them did. Melissa immediately stepped into the conversation again before Eleanor could answer. She explained with playful exaggeration that Eleanor preferred painting landscapes and reading novels rather than worrying about corporate strategies and shareholder meetings. The comment brought another ripple of laughter from the table, although a few people looked slightly embarrassed as they realized Eleanor had not actually said anything herself. Eleanor responded only with a calm nod and a gentle smile, showing no sign that the remarks had bothered her. Her quiet presence made it easy for the group to continue speaking freely about Stonebridge, as though she were simply another distant relative attending a family celebration. Someone mentioned the name of the company's founder and began explaining how the leadership team had changed over the years, describing the board as a powerful group of investors and executives who rarely appeared in public. Eleanor listened carefully to every detail while the conversation unfolded around her, occasionally glancing toward the engagement stage where Daniel and Melissa continued greeting guests under the warm golden lights. For most of the people in that ballroom, Stonebridge corporate group represented opportunity, ambition, and the promise of future success. For Eleanor Brooks, it represented something very different, something that none of the smiling employees in that room had even begun to imagine. The laughter around table 7 slowly faded as the conversation drifted toward another round of drinks and introductions, yet the topic of Stonebridge corporate group continued to appear in nearly every corner of the ballroom. Eleanor Brooks remained seated quietly, observing the shifting clusters of guests as people moved from table to table exchanging business cards and congratulations. The Grand Harbor Hotel ballroom had begun to glow even warmer as the evening progressed, the city lights outside reflecting softly through the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan, while the jazz trio in the corner played a slower melody. For most guests, the evening felt like a perfect celebration of opportunity and connection. Many of them had spent the last decade building their careers inside the same company, and tonight felt like both a personal milestone for Daniel and Melissa and an informal networking event for colleagues who rarely saw each other outside the office. Near the center of the room, Melissa Carter stood confidently beside Daniel, speaking with two senior consultants from the Minneapolis office. Her voice carried clearly as she explained how much she admired the leadership of Stonebridge and how proud she was to be part of a company that valued ambition and growth. Daniel nodded along as she spoke, occasionally adding his own comments about future opportunities within the organization. Their enthusiasm drew the attention of several younger employees who listened with admiration, hoping to learn how they might advance their own careers. Eleanor watched the scene quietly while a server passed by offering another round of sparkling water. She thanked him politely and lifted the glass to her lips, her calm expression never changing. A man from the Chicago operations team eventually returned to table 7 and continued describing the company's history for a small group of guests who had recently joined the conversation. He spoke about how Stonebridge had once been a modest consulting firm with fewer than 30 employees and a single office in Illinois. According to him, the company's dramatic expansion began after a quiet investor group purchased a controlling interest and installed a new strategic direction that focused on disciplined acquisitions and strong financial oversight. The man admitted that most employees did not know much about the investor group because the leadership rarely appeared in public and preferred to work behind the scenes through the board of directors. The mystery surrounding that leadership team seemed to fascinate everyone listening. Several guests offered guesses about which well-known executives might secretly be guiding the company's strategy. One woman suggested that the board must include at least one extremely experienced corporate negotiator because the firm's expansion had been unusually smooth and profitable. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her thoughtful gaze resting briefly on the polished marble floor before returning to the animated faces around the table. No one noticed that the quiet woman they had dismissed as Daniel's artistic sister had been present during every major decision the man was describing. Years earlier, Eleanor had walked through dozens of similar conference rooms reviewing financial reports, negotiating acquisitions, and guiding the long-term strategy that transformed a small regional firm into a company now employing thousands across the country. The guests in the ballroom spoke about Stonebridge with the excitement of people who believed they were watching history unfold from the outside. What none of them realized was that the person responsible for shaping that history was sitting quietly among them, listening patiently as they speculated about decisions she herself had already made. The evening continued to unfold with the comfortable rhythm of a successful engagement celebration, yet the conversations surrounding Stonebridge Corporate Group only grew more animated as the wine and champagne continued to flow. Eleanor Brooks remained seated quietly while the guests around her discussed promotions, leadership changes, and the company's future expansion across several states. At another nearby table, a group of younger analysts had begun debating which senior managers might soon move into executive roles if the rumored restructuring actually happened. One man confidently insisted that the board of directors must already have a plan prepared because companies like Stonebridge rarely made sudden decisions without careful preparation. Eleanor listened to the speculation with calm interest, her fingers resting lightly against the stem of her glass while she studied the expressions of the people speaking so confidently about matters they believed were far beyond their influence. Across the ballroom, Melissa Carter continued moving from one group of colleagues to another with the natural energy of someone who enjoyed being the center of attention. Each time she approached a new circle of guests, she proudly introduced Daniel Brooks as her future husband and reminded everyone that they both worked for one of the fastest-growing consulting firms in the region. Several employees congratulated Daniel and joked that the company seemed to be responsible not only for their careers, but also for bringing people together socially. The mood in the room felt almost celebratory toward the company itself, as though Stonebridge were an honored guest at the party rather than simply an employer shared by many of the attendees. Eventually, Melissa returned again to Table 7 accompanied by two senior consultants who appeared curious about Daniel's family. One of them asked Eleanor politely how often she visited Chicago since Daniel had been living there for several years. Before Eleanor could answer, Melissa gave a playful shrug and explained that Eleanor usually preferred the quiet pace of the West Coast and rarely attended events connected to the corporate world. The consultants smiled politely, assuming the explanation was accurate, and one of them remarked that corporate life certainly was not for everyone. Eleanor responded with the same calm nod she had offered throughout the evening, allowing the assumption to settle naturally in the minds of the people around her. At that moment, another guest joined the table and excitedly shared a rumor he had heard earlier in the evening that several management positions might soon be evaluated by the board of directors as part of the company's next phase of growth. The announcement immediately captured Melissa's attention. She leaned forward eagerly and said that the company needed leaders who truly understood its culture and its employees. Daniel agreed with her and explained that he hoped the board would recognize the dedication of people who had spent years helping the company expand. Eleanor watched her brother speak with genuine confidence about a leadership structure he had never personally met. The guests around the table continued discussing promotions and strategic decisions that might soon affect their careers. Their voices carried excitement and ambition, yet none of them noticed the thoughtful stillness in Eleanor Brooks as she listened to every prediction being made about a future that she herself had already begun to shape. The energy in the ballroom shifted slightly as the evening moved deeper into celebration, the music growing a little livelier while more guests filled the dance floor near the stage. At Table 7, the conversation about Stonebridge Corporate Group continued with the same enthusiasm, yet a subtle change had begun to form among the people speaking with Eleanor Brooks. Earlier in the evening, they had spoken freely, assuming she understood little about the corporate world they proudly described, but the longer she listened, the more a few of them noticed the thoughtful precision in the few questions she occasionally asked. One of the consultants mentioned the company's expansion strategy along the East Coast, describing a recent acquisition that had strengthened Stonebridge's presence in Boston and New York. Eleanor tilted her head slightly and asked a calm question about how the integration process had affected the consulting teams working in those offices. The consultant paused for a moment before answering, surprised by the accuracy of her wording. Integration strategy was not a phrase usually used by people who had no experience in corporate planning. Another guest soon joined the conversation and began discussing the company's quarterly performance, mentioning that several departments had exceeded their targets earlier that year. Eleanor asked quietly whether the improvement had been driven more by the financial advisory division or by the operational consulting teams. The question once again caused a brief silence around the table because it demonstrated a level of understanding that most outsiders would not normally possess. Melissa noticed the shift in attention and laughed lightly, attempting to redirect the tone of the conversation. She explained that Eleanor enjoyed reading about business occasionally, but preferred creative hobbies instead of professional competition. The comment was delivered with the same cheerful confidence Melissa had displayed all evening, yet this time the guests around the table did not immediately laugh. A few of them were now watching Eleanor with more curiosity than amusement. One of the younger analysts leaned forward and asked whether Eleanor had once worked in consulting herself. Eleanor responded calmly that she had spent many years studying how organizations grow and adapt. Her answer was accurate without revealing anything more than necessary. The analyst nodded respectfully, clearly reassessing the quiet woman he had previously dismissed as a casual observer. Across the ballroom, Daniel continued greeting guests near the engagement banner, unaware that the dynamic at table 7 had begun to change. Melissa remained determined to keep the atmosphere light and turn the discussion back toward career advancement within Stonebridge. She told the group that ambitious employees always found opportunities in a company that valued initiative. Eleanor listened patiently before asking one final question in the same gentle tone she had used all evening. She asked which division most of them reported to within the organization. Several guests answered proudly, naming departments that handled corporate strategy, financial consulting, and regional operations. As each person spoke, Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, mentally recognizing the names of teams and offices she had helped shape over the years. The realization slowly began to settle among the guests that the quiet woman beside them seemed to know far more about the company than someone outside the industry should. What none of them fully understood yet was that the calm curiosity in Eleanor Brooks was not the curiosity of an outsider trying to learn about Stonebridge Corporate Group. It was the careful attention of someone who had spent decades guiding the direction of the very company they believed was shaping their future. The quiet curiosity that had begun forming around table 7 slowly spread through the nearby guests as the conversation continued. A few minutes earlier, Eleanor Brooks had simply been Daniel's reserved older sister sitting politely at the edge of the celebration, but now several people were watching her with growing interest. The questions she asked were calm and respectful, yet they carried the tone of someone who understood the inner structure of the company far better than they had first assumed. One of the senior consultants who had been speaking earlier leaned back slightly in his chair and studied her expression with a thoughtful look. He explained that his team worked in strategic operations and that they were responsible for supporting new acquisitions when the company entered additional markets. Eleanor nodded slowly and asked whether the consulting teams had been able to maintain consistent leadership training across the newer offices in Boston and Denver. The consultant blinked with mild surprise because the issue she mentioned had recently been discussed during an internal leadership call that only mid-level managers and above had attended. He answered carefully, explaining that the company had recently introduced a unified training framework designed to align the culture across every regional branch. The answer seemed to satisfy Eleanor, and she thanked him politely for sharing the information. Around the table, the atmosphere had grown noticeably quieter as the guests began exchanging subtle glances with one another. Melissa Carter was the first to break the silence with another light laugh. She waved a hand casually and told everyone not to be fooled by Eleanor's questions. According to Melissa, Eleanor enjoyed reading business magazines and occasionally liked to test herself by asking questions about subjects she had never actually worked in. A few guests smiled politely at the explanation, but the earlier confidence in Melissa's voice had begun to fade slightly. The analyst who had been speaking earlier continued watching Eleanor with curiosity and asked if she had ever considered working in corporate consulting herself. Eleanor replied in the same gentle tone she had used all evening that she had spent most of her professional life studying how organizations grow, how leadership decisions influence long-term stability, and how strong companies protect their employees while expanding into new markets. Her words were calm and measured, yet they carried the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed those decisions firsthand. Across the ballroom, Daniel Brooks, finally approached Table 7 after finishing another round of introductions near the stage. He placed a hand on Melissa's shoulder and asked what everyone had been discussing so seriously. Melissa smiled brightly and explained that they had simply been talking about Stonebridge Corporate Group and the exciting future ahead for employees who worked there. Daniel nodded proudly and added that the company was a place where hard work and loyalty were always recognized. Several guests agreed enthusiastically, repeating the same belief that the board of directors must surely value the dedication of the employees who helped the company succeed. Eleanor listened quietly while her brother spoke, her eyes resting calmly on the glass in front of her. The room around them continued buzzing with conversation and music, yet the small circle at Table 7 had begun to sense that the quiet woman sitting among them was no longer just a curious relative visiting from out of town. The questions she asked and the calm certainty in her voice suggested something far more significant, though none of them had yet connected the final piece of the puzzle that would soon change the entire tone of the evening. For several seconds, the small circle around Table 7 remained unusually quiet, as if everyone present were trying to decide how seriously they should take the calm confidence in Eleanor Brooks's voice. The music in the ballroom continued playing softly and the distant laughter from the dance floor carried across the room, yet the conversation at that table had slowed to a thoughtful pause. Daniel Brooks looked from one guest to another with a slightly puzzled expression, unaware that the tone of the discussion had shifted before he arrived. Melissa Carter quickly stepped in to restore the lively atmosphere she had carefully maintained throughout the evening. She laughed lightly and told Daniel that Eleanor had been entertaining everyone with clever questions about Stonebridge Corporate Group. Melissa explained that Eleanor seemed fascinated by how large companies operate even though she had never actually worked inside the corporate world. Several guests offered polite smiles, but the earlier amusement had softened into curiosity. One of the senior consultants who had been listening closely leaned forward and asked Eleanor directly whether she had ever studied corporate governance or strategic management. The question was respectful rather than mocking, and for the first time that evening the group appeared genuinely interested in her answer. Eleanor met the consultant's gaze calmly and replied that understanding how organizations function had always been important to her because strong companies do not grow by accident. She explained that leadership decisions shape every opportunity that employees experience within an organization, from the smallest office to the executive floor. Her words were spoken gently, yet they carried a quiet certainty that made several listeners sit a little straighter in their chairs. Daniel raised his eyebrows with mild surprise and said he had never realized his sister followed business matters so closely. Eleanor smiled softly and reminded him that people often notice more than others expect. Around the table, a few guests exchanged thoughtful looks as the meaning of her comment settled in. The analyst who had asked earlier questions about consulting leaned forward again and asked Eleanor which part of the company interested her the most. Eleanor considered the question for a moment before answering that she had always believed the board of directors held the greatest responsibility within any organization because their decisions determined the direction of thousands of careers. The consultant who had spoken earlier nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the clarity of her explanation. Melissa felt the attention shifting away from her and laughed again in a slightly brighter tone, explaining that Eleanor always enjoyed sounding mysterious. She told the group that Daniel's sister had a talent for turning ordinary conversations into philosophical discussions. The remark brought a few polite chuckles, but the mood around the table no longer carried the same light-hearted confidence it had earlier in the evening. Eleanor simply rested her hands on the table and looked toward the center of the ballroom where the engagement banner shimmered under the warm lights. The guests nearby were beginning to sense that the quiet woman beside them possessed a level of knowledge that did not match the simple story Melissa had been telling all night. They did not yet understand exactly who Eleanor Brooks was within the world they all shared, but the curiosity growing in their expressions suggested that the answer would soon become impossible to ignore. The quiet tension surrounding Table 7 deepened as the guests slowly realized that the evening had reached a turning point none of them had expected when the celebration began. The music from the jazz trio continued in the background, and the laughter from the dance floor still echoed softly through the ballroom, yet the small circle around Eleanor Brooks had grown noticeably still. Daniel Brooks looked from Eleanor to the curious faces of his colleagues, sensing that the conversation had moved somewhere he did not fully understand. Melissa Carter folded her arms lightly across the edge of the table and smiled with a confidence that had begun to feel slightly forced. She repeated that Eleanor simply enjoyed discussing business ideas even though she had never worked in a corporate environment. Several guests nodded politely, but the explanation no longer seemed convincing. One of the senior consultants cleared his throat and asked Eleanor a final question. He asked her calmly whether she had ever attended a board meeting for Stonebridge Corporate Group. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Eleanor rested her hands quietly on the table and looked around the circle of attentive faces. Her expression remained gentle and composed, the same calm presence she had carried throughout the evening. After a moment, she reached into her handbag and removed a small leather card holder. She opened it slowly and placed a simple business card on the polished surface of the table where everyone could see it. The card was elegant and understated, printed with only a few lines of text. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then the consultant closest to the card leaned forward to read the title printed beneath Eleanor Brooks's name. His expression changed first. The conversation at the table stopped completely as several others leaned closer to see the same words. The title identified Eleanor Brooks as chairwoman and majority shareholder of Stonebridge Corporate Group. A quiet wave of realization passed through the group. The people who had spent the entire evening discussing company leadership suddenly understood that the person responsible for guiding many of those decisions had been sitting beside them all along. Daniel stared at the card in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the quiet sister he believed he understood with the authority described in front of him. Melissa's confident smile slowly faded as she realized the meaning of the moment. Eleanor did not raise her voice or display any sense of triumph. She simply looked around the table with the same calm patience she had shown all evening. In a steady tone, she explained that strong companies depend on people who care about the future of the organization and the well-being of its employees. She added that leadership decisions were never about pride or status, but about responsibility. Several guests lowered their eyes, remembering the casual jokes that had been made earlier in the evening. Eleanor then thanked everyone politely for sharing their thoughts about the company and stood from her chair. The ballroom around them continued celebrating as she walked calmly toward the exit, leaving behind a table of employees who would never forget the quiet moment when they realized that the most powerful person in their professional world had been listening to them all night.